This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so is Jody the only person not on? Let's see here.
I'm here.
Jody's on.
Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yeah. And it doesn't look like, do we have Jeremy or no? No, Jeremy. Okay, we'll give it like one more minute and then get started. I hope someone like is working on like a compilation of the craziest video conference call, like family background. That would just be a great compilation to put together.
It looks like Jeremy is on via the phone, Doug. When you look at the people who are on.
I'm on.
Okay.
I'm on.
Okay. All right, great. So why don't we get started? So today is a work session, call to order our work session. This is for the, if everyone could, why don't, Jeanine, why don't we go through the mute everyone and then I'll unmute.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay. So for the recording, this is May 13, 2020, Hastings on Hudson board work session for the budget. Okay, so I just want to get clear on what we're doing. So today we're targeting 2 hours to have a conversation around some of the budget items that we had been talking about for the past several weeks. The goal is for May 19th to have the final budget ready for the board to vote on, so that it can be put on the ballot for a vote by absentee on June 9th. Okay, so if we could keep Valerie and Maureen, I really want to make sure that the board just has time to get any final thoughts and questions out. So if we could keep the presentation to 15 20 minutes at the outside, I think that would be great, so that we can dig in and talk through some stuff. What I would love for administrators on the call, building leaders, central office administrators, it would be great if you could kind of play the role of experts to answer questions as the board just moves through some of these decisions. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Valerie and Maureen.
Sure. I'll take just a minute to kind of frame how this presentation was organized and how it reflects questions that were asked at the May 4th board meeting by our board trustees. Again, I always want to thank Maureen for her diligence in pulling all this together and working really hard to make sure it reflects our best thinking. So with that said, what we focused on were a few areas that our board trustees shared with us last week that they wanted us to consider ways to include them back into the original plan. And so Maureen will review what those things were, and I can speak to certainly one of the other sort of areas of concern that we had is we really pressed our administrators to find savings or reductions so that we could make sure that we were ready for the 3 assessments that the governor indicated that school districts would be expected to see a reduction, 20% reduction in either their state aid number or their I'm sorry, the other number, the other amount of money.
Foundation aid, Valerie.
Remember the state aid and foundation aid. So that preparation was still at the forefront of our thinking as we went through to prepare this these few slides for you. And we wanted to make sure that, if the reduction caused a ripple effect in other buildings and that it led to disruption, we couldn't, we put we restored those items, and you'll see how we did that with the AOK, the areas of knowledge courses in the middle school, that while they offered them up generously, the ripple effects of those were across the other not only schools but departments. So that's the rationale for for that decision. And what we also wanted to do was to make sure that we reemphasize some of the expenses that we anticipate associated with the reentry into these buildings, whether it is in the summer or the fall, and we're learning a lot every day about what types of items those are. And we also wanted to put some meat on the bones around the compensatory program outline. So I want to thank Melissa and Maureen, and we sat down and kind of really worked through as much of this as we could. So I turn it over to Maureen.
Okay, thank you, Valerie. So yeah, so today we'll go through this fairly quickly so we can kind of get into the discussion, just to kind of show you where we are in our budget and what would reflect our current proposed budget for the board to consider voting on next week. So our current budget overview reflects a 20% reduction in foundation aid. That is what we felt we needed to accomplish with the unknown of what the current funding level from the state is going to be. So that is how we came to the number that we needed to reduce, and that was what drove some of the decisions that were made in this last month and reductions. Because again, with the, as Valerie had spoken about, the state has made it very clear that there will be 3 assessment periods in which they will be able to change the funding across, not only for schools, but in all state funding. And unfortunately, because we have not, the state right now, it's not clear whether they'll receive any money from the federal government. We had to plan for that type of reduction based upon what was being told to us from the state. So that is our budget overview. And just a quick highlight that if you can see, our budget to budget is going up less than 1% at a 0.68. And currently this budget reflects a tax rate increase of less than 1%, a 0.95. Next, Janine. Just some quick budget highlights. Currently, the last slide, our budget is tax cap compliant. It is currently 51,000 below the allowable cap. So we're actually below the cap currently. The budget reflects a 20% reduction in foundation aid for the 2021 school year. Again, we spoke about the difference. The foundation aid is a smaller aid number. We get approximately this year, we got about $5.2 million of state aid, and 3.2 of that is foundation aid, and that's a non-expense driven aid, and that is the number where which we are assuming a 20% reduction. Our budget also reflects a reduction in interest income. As everyone knows, the interest rate, the Fed did cut the interest rate to help, help with the economy. So that does mean that we have a loss of income related to that, and we've made those adjustments. We also have reduced our sales tax revenue, again, just based upon what we're seeing in the current economy. Our budget to budget is again below a 1.1% rollover increase. It's a 0.68%. I think when we started this budget conversation, we were at 3% or so in a budget to budget. Our current tax rate's below 1%. We also currently have the board of the last week increased balances in reserves with some monies that became available with our closing, and that'll help protect us against any additional losses of revenue or unanticipated expenses. Because as we thought about presenting this budget, what was also very important is that we don't know what those 2 other assessment periods may bring. And the thought was, in addition to planning for a reduction in state aid, having putting money back into reserves will help us navigate any challenges, any further reduction of revenues that could potentially occur, and any unanticipated expenses. By putting those money in reserves, that positions us to be able to deal with something like that if that were to occur. The increased reserves will ensure that the district has enough cash flow in the event of late tax payments, because as we've discussed, and I'm not going to go over that again, but we discussed that there has been, the county, and it was the right thing to do. They're allowing tax people to pay their property taxes late without penalty. And again, we just wanted to ensure that we had enough cash that we can, be able to pay our bills and not worry. And if there's a delay in receiving some payments, we'll be okay with that. Again, and we also included this budget that you were presented, that tax where we are currently reflects some one-time COVID expenses that were rolled into the budget, and we'll go through those in a little bit greater detail tonight, just to break down the dollars associated with that. These are one-time expenses. We're using into appropriated fund balance as a one-time revenue source, as we view these as part of our reentry plan, as we're required to develop according to state guidelines. Next, please.
Maureen, I just have one quick question for you on that slide. Proposed tax rate for next year under 1%. Can you give the board any indication as to where, we are in relation to other districts around us? Like, how are we comparing?
Yes, so we are actually lower. And again, each district, I mean, I think thankfully we started our process fairly early, and because of that, and because of the work of our administrators, I think we really were able to get our budget down to address the state aid reduction. So we are definitely lower than our counterparts, and some of them are facing different challenges in assessments and things like that. So I certainly, not everyone is again low, because everyone's making substantial reductions to their budgets, but I would say that there are many people that are in that 2% range, 1.5 to 2%. Again, we really felt it was important to try, continue to try to keep that tax rate increase as low as possible. I mean, we always, we really work to get that under 1%, or, as low as we can. And just to give you some sense of what that represents for an average taxpayer, I don't know if anyone's interested. So if a person's home was valued, their sales value was $750,000, this tax rate increase would be approximately about $150 a year increase in their taxes. So it's that's where we currently are.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so again, this is just state aid. We spoke about this. Just again, we went through how that's calculated, and it's really only there because sometimes in the newspaper, they'll report out what the proposed budget reflected, and that larger number on top was what was part of the governor's budget for the year. But that was prior to him saying that I'm going to be reducing aid, because again, they did have to, in fairness, the state had to pass a budget, and they did say that if things had been fine, that is the money we would have received. But you can see now the reductions are based upon, where we are today, and that's how we get to that $4.4 million number that we are using in our budget. Next, Janine. Okay, so this is kind of where we ended up after the last meeting, and Valerie had mentioned earlier, as we went through, again, all those reductions, and I know the board knows this, they were, we've basically been working through these, and they were put together in about a week and a half time, because of the fact we were notified that the state was, facing this really significant shortfall, and the dollar amount had grown substantially. So as we went back and vetted through all the reductions, and as we had showed last time, we were over what the 20% reduction was needed. So when we added all those things up, we had a little bit of an ability to go in and make sure that each of the proposed reductions, that each building principal did really work very hard on. What, were they going to be, could they work, and what kind of, disruption would they have across the school district? So after we went through and again revisited with the administrative team, we were able to kind of put forth what we felt as though we could comfortably or understand that it could be done. So this is what is currently reflected in the budget from the May 13th of the May 4th meeting, and what is currently reflected in the overview that you had as the start of this meeting. We are moving forward with a reduction in kindergarten. And again, this is really based on enrollment numbers. We've looked at it historically, although we do appreciate, we don't know if there's if the real estate is a little stagnant now because of COVID. But even that being said, I think based upon the numbers historically, comparing it against 5 years or even longer of data, the number would suggest that our current trending enrollment would put us at 5 sections, similar to where we ended up this year. So this is something we do every year as part of the budget. You know, we were able to kind of go back in and look, and in many years we'll plan for 6, and then if it doesn't happen, we will reduce it to 5 anyway. But we felt it was really important to, as we're looking at making other reductions, that if we felt comfortable making that reduction now, we felt it was the right, you know, way to go forward. So again, that is the reduction of a kindergarten section, a reduction of a kindergarten aide. And again, we're estimating our kindergarten number will be about 100 this year, based on 100 and very low 100, based on current numbers. We're also reducing the hours in the clerk's office. PE reduction of sections at Hillside of a 0.3. This person is actually going to be needed to come down to the high school to help fill some needs down there. But it is a reduction of PE overall. Math interventionist, that's a 0.8 reduction. We're also reducing at the high school level and at the middle school some of the ICT sections. Again, this is based on enrollment, and if you have questions, of course, you can, you know, speak to Laura and Lou on these. And then again, reducing the science, and we have details of, Lou can speak to that if you have any further questions. And this was gave us the ability to not hire for retirement we had. And then again, the reduction of a 0.3 of art electives. Then we also decided not to take the full reduction of the modified team reduction that Jesse had proposed, because by restoring some of that money, so instead of 19,000, we're taking 9, that allow him the flexibility to ensure that all students will have access at the middle school level to modified or intramural opportunities, and that no one will be shut out. It may, Jesse will be creating different opportunities. I mean, he'll have to, prior to that, once we see what kids are interested in, but this will allow flexibility and creating opportunities for children to participate in sports they're interested in. And then we are moving forward with the reduction of Saturday building checks. And as part of this also, when we were going through and finalizing our budget, we made the decision also to restore some money to the theater department for the tech expenses, because in looking at the reductions that we had worked through with Gerard, it became clear that it was cutting, you know, significantly into some of the theater and their ability to do some of the things. So we did restore $6,000 as part of this final budget that is before you tonight. And that gave us a final net number of $594,000. And that is how we were able to address the additional shortfall that we anticipate in state aid. So that's our final. Yes.
Yeah, one other thing, just to loop back to the theater tech expenses, we heard from board members at the May 4th meeting that tech experience in 4th grade was really critical. So I want to thank, you know, Gerard and Melissa for working through that to, you know, find reductions. But if that tech opportunity is associated with a particular kind of, you know, player performance, it's really important for there to be funds available for that to take place. So those dollars are restored to that 4th grade, you know, area, you know, in particular as it pertains to the tech component of it. And of course, you know, if it means that, you know, there's a different kind of performance is necessary, so those additional dollars can be utilized for that. But, you know, we heard that you know, that was a really important experience, and obviously, you know, this gave us an opportunity to make sure that continued.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So we tried to restore, you know, in this budget, creating opportunities and things that would either shut children out of an opportunity similar to the modified sports. We wanted to make sure to put some dollars there so that everyone would still have an opportunity to participate, and that it wasn't where now children would be shut out of an activity. So that is why you see that restoration there based on the last board, that May 4th conversation. Next, Janine. Okay, so I'm just going to, so these are the one-time COVID-related expenses that are, again, part of our proposed preliminary budget. that we now have put some dollars to, and we have added that into our budget line item. We what this reflects is the breakdown of those dollars. It's $250,000, $125,000 of it. And Melissa, there are some slides that detail this, so I'm not going to speak about it because there's a lot more details to that 125,000. There's 25,000 for web-based supplementary resources. Melissa can kind of, she'll speak to that as she goes through the instructional support program. We are also putting a line item for additional cleaning products needed for full building sanitation. This is a line item in the event that we have multiple closings. And again, this money will only be accessed if needed, because again, we of course always have cleaning products, but the type of cleaning and the sanitation that was required did require us to buy for each of those events. It was an additional like close to $10,000 worth of different types of cleaning products that were needed to do that type of cleaning in both buildings. We're also putting a line item for personal protective equipment for staff, students, and visitors. We've already started to secure some masks this year, and I can tell you the masks are extremely expensive, disposable masks. And although we can, of course, we hope many people will have them if we're required to wear them next year. But we, as a school district, we are required to provide them if people do come to our building without them. So putting some money there, and also this would be for our nursing staff and different areas in which they may need some more specialized PPE. We also are anticipating that we may, need some additional dollars for both daily substitutes as well as leave replacements, because if again, what is being reported is in factual, there will be times that some of our employees may need to be out. It could be on even a voluntary isolation, but when people are out for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever those days are, we need to prepare to have replacements in the event we're seeing an uptick in that, even precautionary times when people may need to stay at home. We're also anticipating additional nursing support. And again, this is all tied to some of the guidance documents that we're getting from the state. And this will help us when we're preparing for our reentry plan, because we're anticipating an increase in some nursing support and creating rooms for breaking up the nursing office, at least temporarily, at the Farragut, so that we can create different areas to treat different children that come in. So that will require some additional nursing support. And we think 20,000, we have some part-time nurses. We think adding some additional hours there will cover us for that expense. That brings the entire COVID one-time expenses to $250,000. And the reason I keep saying one-time expenses is we're using fund balance to pay for them, and they're a non-recurring expense, and it's also a non-recurring revenue. So we're being very thoughtful about those amounts, and again, putting them in separate line items, and they will be, if they're not needed, we will not use those funds, and then they would be returned the following year in terms of the cleaning and some of those additional line items. Next, Janine. So Melissa can speak now about the compensatory program.
So we wanted to give a bit more detail about where we are in the planning process for our summer compensatory program. And we wanted to target students who were most at risk for having larger gaps in proficiency upon their return to school. So you can see from the selection criteria, and this was something that I worked together with Laura, Tesfa, Jeanette, and the building leaders, and also Janice on. So we're looking at students with IEPs, English language learners performing below proficiency, and our vulnerable students who scored a level 1 on the state assessments in ELA and mathematics. Our primary areas of focus through the compensatory program will be ELA and mathematics, with an integration with social studies and science. And of course, we provide special education related services during the course of the program as well. So the goal is really to reinforce key power skills and standards that are essential to know in ELA, mathematics, science, and social studies. So when students are returning to school, they're well positioned to pick up with their studies. Janine, next slide. Okay. So we are anticipating 18 mixed age groupings. So for example, there would be a kindergarten, like a K1, a 2-3, a 4-5, etc. And we're anticipating, based on our numbers, that there would be 3 sections for each of those mixed age groupings. But again, we want to make sure that we are targeting this. So we're in the process of finalizing who is participating and what that will look like. But we do know that we're anticipating instruction that will look approximately 3 hours a day, that the program would run 3 days each week, and it would run for 3 weeks. We do want to take a blended approach, and so having that live synchronous video conferencing instruction will be an integral part of the process. And then there will be supplemental resources that are that adaptive web-based component. So what it might look like is a teacher is providing a mini lesson to a small group of students, and then the students have the application process where they're then applying what they've been taught, and they're using resources that would allow them both access to content and also thinking about their leveled needs. So when we're thinking about reading instruction, for example, students are coming in at different levels, and we want to make sure that we're meeting them where they are. The program would be designed to differentiate to meet the needs of the learners. So for example, there may be a group of 6 students that are receiving that synchronous instruction, or there may be a smaller 2-to-1 situation. So again, based on who is in the program and what their specific areas of need are, we would make sure that the program is adapted so that we could really meet them and build the capacity that they need. Next slide. Thank you. So in addition, there would be 2 to 3 hours a week that would be allocated for teachers for collaboration, planning, reviewing student progress. And that is really key, because that the information that they're receiving both from that web-based adaptive component and from their interactions with students would then be used formatively to then plan for what those future lessons would look like. So approximately 57 hours daily would represent 19 teachers. So thinking about the 18 teachers that would be facilitating those 18 mixed grade sessions that I was describing, and an E&L teacher for direct K-12 instructional support. And that reflects that 3 hours a day. And we would reach approximately 125 students. So looking at Hillside, that would be approximately 60 students based on need. At Farragut, approximately 35 students. And then at the high school, approximately 30 students. So when we're thinking about compensation for those 57 hours of daily direct instruction, that would be based on the teacher rate of pay, and there would be a range for that based on the individual teacher, and that's between $65 and $125 per hour, and that would be, again, for teachers and related service providers. And the related services portion would be scheduled purposefully for IEP students, and that would account for approximately 90 hours weekly and would incorporate speech, OT, PT, and the school psychologist.
So in terms of, and thank you, Melissa, and we also, Melissa, Maureen and I looked very carefully at this program since it was new. And we also were, we didn't know to what extent we would, even potentially be in the building. We really wanted to rely on some other web-based digital resources or web-based resources for our students. So we're introducing a couple of those, which are, evidence-based and really do support children where they are, and then the content is, delivered to them, on the basis of, where they are along the lines of the skills and knowledge and content. So that's very important, and it'll be represented across K-12. And so we were able, in thinking of the program in that way, rather than it being, only related to kind of the traditional ways that summer programs are designed, we felt that we could reduce the original cost. So we originally thought of this to be, a much longer program, probably many more content areas covered, and that proposed amount was $250,000. We reduced that by $100,000 because we were mindful of all the reductions that were being made and all the, all the efforts of the budget managers who worked really hard to, bring forth 4 different, sets of reductions. So we felt that, it made sense to be able to, offer the program, but also to rely heavily upon, a redesign around, knowing what the children need and being very targeted about organizing them with our educators and related service providers, and making sure that we were looking at who was making progress, and so we could move students through. So as Melissa said, it makes a big difference for us to be able to calibrate what skills our students are going to need as they enter the new year, and what can we do now to get them as close to those recovery as possible. So I just wanted to mention that as well, that there's a reduction here in the amount of $100,000. So the total price tag is $150,000.
Just so I'm clear, is that not represented on slide 8 anywhere? One-time expenses related reentry plan?
Yeah, no, it's sorry, let me just look. Yes, it is. It is. It's just that she broke it down further.
It's the
top is the 125 plus the 25 of web-based supplemental.
Got
So
it.
that's
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
But we had talked about that just the instructional piece was 250 at one point, Doug, and that's kind of, we were talking about that at one point being just that piece of it.
And Maureen and I will tag team on these reminders. So as Maureen has said, the COVID-19 financial crisis, is not a one-year event. We've said this over and over again. This is, what's happening right now from, March 18th to when we actually end the school year, will be with us in the new school year. So, we have to really make sure we think about the budget in that way, which is very different from any school district having, any school district's budgeting process. Nothing is normal or the same as any previous year this year. So all the decisions are centered around that reality that, we could, be in the midst of a financial crisis for 2 to 3 or 5 years, down the road. So we just wanted to, reemphasize that to our community and to the, board trustees, that that's a really fundamental, sort of notion to keep in mind. And that we wanted to make sure the plan was sustainable through COVID. We don't know everything, as Maureen said, but we're learning things every day. And we have a guidance summary that will be shared with the reentry committee that will be notified this week, or that when our first date or meeting will be, so that we can start processing the work ahead. But there are a lot of things here that are, Maureen and I, were just mentioning before the meeting. We were very happy that we were, forward thinking with regards to, putting this, at the very beginning of this budgeting process, knowing that it was a reality. So at least now it's not a matter of going back in later and saying, by the way, we need to account for these things. So, I just wanted to make sure that, I thank Maureen and Melissa for being very, and Joe Moderato, who's also been behind the scenes doing a lot of work to procure masks and gloves and lots of hand sanitizer and thermometers and so forth. Maureen, you take it up.
Sure. So again, so like Valerie said, so that's where the lens we've always been working through, and it is hard. And as everything we've proposed and the reductions and everything, it's not only about this year. We really wanted to ensure with the unknown of the next, definitely obviously next year and probably a few years after, we wanted to make sure that everything we were doing this year is that we're not coming back next year and having a $3 million, deficit. I think it was really, as we talk about putting money in reserves, it's not just, we want to provide people tax relief, but we're also trying to ensure that we can sustain ourselves. Again, in the 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23 school year, I think even getting to that 22, 23, it's going to be very challenging, but everything we're doing is that, in trying to create a plan, not only for 2021, but certainly we were thinking of it over a few years' time to ensure that we're being financially responsible. So as much as we can be with the, the limited amount of money we have. So, that was where what the proposal, why we proposed to put money into the reserves, was really in thinking about getting us through those next couple of years, because again, they've been saying it all along, that the retirement systems, as the board knows, the amount that we're required to fund is based upon how well basically the stock market is doing. And we know that they're, the last time they went through a difficult time, the large increases we saw over the course of those years. So we feel that the funding of the reserves, again, that the board has already acted on to put money in those retirement reserves. We think it was really great financial planning to not only shore us up for at least the next few years in terms of meeting those obligations. And that's extremely important as we think about how we're spending money. This crisis will also, another thing we need to consider as we speak later tonight with the board, this crisis will definitely increase the amount of tax certiorari filings, because not only the commercial properties, as we know, commercial properties, when they're closed, the way they file grievances is based upon the revenue they generate. It's not based on the value of the property. It's based upon the earnings. It's based upon their financial statement of the year. So when you have restaurants that are closed and not earning revenue, they will in fact be able and successfully to do so. So we do anticipate a tax cert filing increase, and we also anticipate that homeowners will likely we'll see a large uptick, and we have quite a few every year anyway, but I imagine that we'll see a large increase of what is called the SCAR filing for residential homeowners. So that's another thing to consider, because that especially the commercial properties, when they file against the district, it brings down the overall assessed value, which does drive the tax rates. We have to be mindful as we think about these things. When things like that happen, we need to be able to offset them with monies from the tax cert to not only pay the obligations, but to help with those the tax rate increasing significantly because of them. One thing we do need to consider tonight is if any funds are restored by Albany, and that would only be if the federal government, of course, were to give them money. I think we really need to be, thoughtful about, if we were to find that out at one point, I think we're better off, holding some of the reductions we're making and using it to either offset taxes or to stabilize our funding for next year by either, putting some additional funds in a tax certiorari, or again, maybe reducing the tax rate, just by, I think that we need to think that through if there is going to be money, from the federal government at all. Budget vote is June 9th, budget hearing is June 1st, and our adoption needs to be on May 19th. It cannot legally go, beyond that date. I mean, it can go to the 21st, but that would, we would maybe not be able to get all of the information out to our homeowners in time, or voters, not our homeowners, our voters. So I think that's it, Janine, right? I believe, yeah. So I think we can I just wanted to kind of frame that as part of the discussion around some additional monies that we have not yet appropriated to a reserve, based upon where we are currently in this fiscal year. So I know the board was disinterested in speaking about that as well.
Thanks, Maureen and Valerie, and everyone who's contributed to putting these, and Melissa, and everyone's contributed to putting all these thoughts together. Obviously, the jigsaw puzzle, the 3D jigsaw puzzle, continues to be a challenge. So can you maybe, just working backwards, talk a little bit about the tax cert? What do we have in there currently, and what is your kind of, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but as you're thinking about what should be in there, just talk maybe about a comfort level, and that would be helpful.
Well, currently we have about 900,000 or so in the tax cert, and we have I looked at it, we have about $12 million worth of potential. We already, prior to the COVID, we have $12 million, and that means refunds, challenges against us. But we're never, you're never going to settle it at the full amount. So that would, I would never, even if we had $12 million, I would never recommend ever funding it to that dollar amount, because it is a filing and it doesn't really represent the settled amount. So typically they're settled around 40%. So currently we have maybe close to $6 or $7 million of obligations there anyway without the COVID crisis. And many of those, with the reassessment, I think we saw a little bit of a stabilization there, but I think with something like the COVID and the loss of revenue of all the commercial properties and even like townhouse condos and which we have quite a few large assessments pending with the condos and apartments in town. If they see a drop in their rental income, they can also challenge and get a significant amount of money. So that being said, I think I think it's just to be mindful that we do have some obligations there. So when we think about some of the additional money, we're never going to have, I would never want to hold too much money in reserve, but I also think it's irresponsible not to keep money for at least what we anticipate paying out for the next 3 or 4 years. So that being the way I would look at it, I would say that, somewhere in the $2 or $3 million range, at least would be able to address things over the next 4 years. Like if we actually had to pay something out, because I don't think, we don't typically, we have a few large singletons that could be like $800,000 refunds, but for the most part, we the last few years been spending $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000 a year out of, in terms of refunds. So, I'm lucky, we're happy we have what we have in there, but just as we think about these additional funds and how the board may want to use those, just to think that most districts are anticipating an uptick in tax cert filings. It's just food for thought. And it's always a good place. We do have the obligations to put money there if the board felt that was a good place to put money. So, I'd be comfortable. I would love to put 1.5 million. We don't have that type of money to put in there, but we're also dealing with the budget crisis. So trying to weigh those two things. And that's kind of where I'm torn. It's a good place to put more money, but we'll just be thoughtful about, how much we keep in the reserve because it's also a tough time.
Can you just maybe inform the board, let's say a $500,000 settlement got a decision came down for 500 grand in November.
Right.
How do we pay that way? Over what time period? How does that get paid out?
You have to pay it out. You have to pay it
Immediately, one time.
90 days or something, but and the only way to pay it is either you have a tax cert reserve or you have to borrow the money. Those are the two ways you do have to pay it. So we've paid out, historically we have paid out judgments of 900,000 in like one shot, historically in Hastings. So, and we do have obligations. I was looking today, you have some smaller ones that are maybe 80,000, 90,000, but we do currently have a few that are meaning one particular filer that with multiple years because they build up over years, right? They typically build up 5 or 6 years. You're paying back 5 or 6 years worth of refunds on those properties, not just a year at a time on commercials. So, the new ones that are going to file, we wouldn't be settling those next year or the year after. But I always think it's important when we make financial decisions, it's good to know what your obligations are. That's all. It's just more food for thought. It's always why we're trying to balance what's the right amount to have in reserves. It's important to know just in general that these are obligations and we know of them because they file against us. We're aware of them. It's important as we're making decisions for the district to be aware that there are financial obligations that we do have. We don't know exactly what they'll be, but not to have I always believe we should always have a certain, at least a $900 to $1 million to a 1.2 in reserves, because if not, when they come due, you have to pay for them. And then you have to borrow the money, and then you're borrowing money and actually, which costs interest, right? You have to pay the money back. And it actually burdens future taxpayers for obligations that were from the past. So I think it's always, in my mind, the right thing to reserve money for those obligations.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. I think there's someone is on the phone that's a little noisy. If I'm looking at caller 2 and 3, I'm not sure if anyone's identified themselves as caller 2 or 3, but if you could mute yourself, we'd appreciate it. Okay, that's helpful as we think about what to
Excuse
do.
me for a minute. Can we test if Jody Meyer, can you speak? Are we hearing you, Jody?
Can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think it was you, Jody. Okay.
Can you mute me?
We can
yes,
mute
I
everyone.
Mute everyone.
And then we'll just unmute. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so so I think that's a conversation, but maybe we'll come back to that conversation, which is essentially with these surpluses that are one time and need to really be held for a variety of different possible things. Why don't we have that as the final conversation? Just wanted to get some clarification on the tax cert stuff as we start to have that. So let me just kick it off to the board to see if they've got any questions about what was reviewed in this deck.
Yeah, I have a question, I guess, Maureen. Is the special ed inclusion coordinator that or facilitator or whatever the title was, is that included in the budget? I was trying to figure out where it would show up. You're on mute.
Yes, it is included in the budget because it is shifts of staff, but the position is included.
Okay, and then well, I think you answered this already. One of my questions was, what do we do if the state funding is not decreased as much, and turns out we have extra money? Was that in one of your slides where you said we should put that towards next year to make sure that we're not in the same crunch?
Well, yeah, and I think that's what's so challenging, for everybody. And I think that the timing of that, unfortunately, I don't think is going to happen right before the budget vote. So yeah, so if for some reason there's like federal stimulus money given to the districts, well, there's a couple of things you could do. So the board, if there were to be, let's just just say there was like a significant amount of $600,000 or $700,000, the board then could, being we have additional revenue, the board then could either adjust the budget if they chose to do so. So meaning if there was a big restoration, and I'm just playing this out, and just say the kindergarten number ended up being larger, like just if we got a federal restoration and there was an expense that you felt warranted adding a position back, the board, because you would be getting additional revenue, could allocate, could increase the total spend of the budget to recognize this additional revenue for a particular purpose. They could do that. You could also, at that point, if we had additional money and we said, okay, wow, we weren't anticipating this, the idea would be not to spend it, and then then we would use it to like appropriate toward the next year's school budget, similar to what we're doing this year with that $1.6 million number. That would be an opportunity to put that, put money back toward the offset of the following year. So, one way or the other, I mean, the board would always have the ability, if there was an emergency type of expense or something they felt strongly needed to be addressed, they could in fact appropriate some of that revenue. But again, I think as we spoke about earlier, because of the uncertainty of this not being a one-year event, it would be wise to be very careful, even if there was a restoration, of how we use that money.
And just one other point to remember, districts like Hastings are considered low-need districts. They're not, we don't have the same demographic as, some of the districts that have tremendous, need related to being income insecure and so forth. And certainly this COVID-19 crisis did not help them. You probably all read about the anticipated layoffs of close to 200 people from the Yonkers City School District. If there are additional monies that are coming from the federal government to Albany, I don't expect that districts like Hastings and districts in this region of Westchester are going to expect to see much of that money, because the formula is based upon how much money we receive from Title I. And we traditionally only received somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe $33,000, and our restoration this time around was about $38,000, if I'm correct, Maureen.
Yes, that's correct.
So that's what we're talking about in terms of restoration. So I wanted you to keep that in mind. That we're of the opinion that isn't, if there were a restoration, it would be somewhere in that neighborhood, because the big five and and other districts upstate have a tremendous amount of need, and I'm sure anyone cutting that number of staff members is certainly going to get the attention of Albany and potentially, get some financial assistance.
Yeah,
Additional
and
financial assistance.
yeah, and I think also the other piece of that, Valerie, is, I mean, like, again, just to, if in fact, I think also if in fact there is a time and that does happen, which I agree with you, I think it would just, in hearing again, what we're hearing from our, not only state government, federal government, unemployment being at an all-time high, right? So I think that these are all things we all hear. If there were money to come back, like, we could have that conversation at that time. Unfortunately, we're not even going to know that. I don't think, and it doesn't seem, I'm saying, even as what they're talking about at the federal government, that they're saying it's going to take them months to bang out any type of news package, because there'll be a lot of wrangling around it. So I think if there was any type of restoration, whatever those dollars may be at that point, which I'm not that hopeful about, we can certainly have a conversation, but we just have to kind of move forward with what we know today, which is not much, unfortunately, but that, we're just going on what we're hearing, which again, is that 20% number. And that's really what we've been just all trying to, meaning not only in Hastings, but even with my colleagues and everyone in Westchester has been using that. And similar, the thought process right now, and just because what we're hearing, many districts like Hastings are not confident that there'll be a restoration. That, just because we're just trying to be as
April 30th, and what were the 3 other dates, right? I guess what are the 3 dates now? It's
they're September 30th and then December 30th. So I think, and then what'll happen is they probably need a few weeks, because that's kind of like the end of their quarter. That's their quarters. Fiscal year for the state of New York begins April 1st. So they have like different measurement periods that they're using in different quarters. So I guess that's how they'll figure it out. I mean, I think already that they're with the delays in even the income tax filing, I think that's going to be fairly significant for the state, right? Just a 3-month lag, and even people paying their income taxes. And if that were to continue, I mean, and maybe people just don't pay them either. So, I mean, I think right now there's so much unknown. And I mean, again, at least the federal government, and I don't know if it's all politics, but they, are suggesting, well, states, that aren't managing themselves are not going to get big bailouts. So, I mean, I think, we're just, I think it's our best plan is to plan for making sure we're solvent, that we are able to move forward and make sure that if and when there's a need for the state to cut funding, that we've planned for that, and we're not in a position where we're short money. And I think that's all we're trying to do. And we'll definitely welcome if there is any money to be, given back, and then we'll definitely, if that were to happen, the board can certainly, to discuss it at the time. And again, because you would need to direct us and what to do with that anyway, if that were to happen.
So I just want to step in here, and I know we're going to probably come up against time, and we will, obviously go as long as we need to, but I think we're really going to try to keep it pretty short. I'd like to there's a lot of conversations I think that are, kind of interesting from a curricular perspective or whatnot, but that may not directly impact the budget. And I would love if board members were able to just kind of share, what do you need more clarity on, or what decisions do you feel you want to make or need to make or want to share with the rest of the board in your process to get to a place where you're comfortable to be able to vote on this budget next Tuesday.
I feel as if my questions have largely been answered. We are able to go ahead with inclusive classrooms and begin to roll that out with the facilitator given this budget. There was a little bit of money for tech and modified to be able to help, I think a large amount of students with that funding. And it seems from the weigh-in from special ed that the ICT classes that they took out or reduced, a certain section, that they felt that those students would still be properly helped. In terms of science and foreign and world language, not being able to rehire for those positions right now, it sounds like it's just too, the budget is too tight and we have too many concerns going forward to manage that right now. Just in my thinking, in a few years, if numbers stabilize and somehow our commercial base expands and we have more funds there and, somehow our base increases, I'd love to revisit the world language discussion to make, if it's at all possible to make that have a meaningful reentry in 5th grade and maybe at Hillside, to increase professional development again. And so those are the things on my mind, getting back to sort of where we were in terms of some essential areas. But I just don't see any other way right now. And given the weigh-in of all the professionals who are working on this and have come up with these numbers, it seems that they feel kids are really being supported in this budget in the essential ways they need to be.
Thanks, Allison. Just one point to point out, and that was helpful to hear, is that, when a budget gets really tight, and let's say the things we were potentially looking to eliminate or reduce or cut back in the end of February, the probability that we're able to add those back in the future becomes lower because you've got to go directly to the taxpayers to do that. Here, I think the hope is, and none of us really have a crystal ball to know how this is going to shake out, the hope is that some of that revenue can get restored from the state so that some of these reductions and shaving in different places can be restored, hopefully, again, fingers crossed, there's a lot of what ifs, can be restored more readily without going directly to the taxpayers than it would happen in a normal scenario, because we would hope we get some portion of that $900,000 back that we're cutting out right now. So I think it's a great point, and hopefully some of that, whether it's science or world language, whatnot, can be brought back at some point.
All right, Doug, because that is exactly it. When we proposed our initial budget, this was like pre-COVID, none of these reductions were in there, but the majority of reductions that are being proposed are related to a loss of anticipated state aid, which, like you said, is about $900,000 from where we started, and the loss of we were also losing sales tax income, we're also losing interest income. So when you put all those numbers together, we were, the deficit for us was getting larger. So to your point, when there is a restoration in the future, and when we say whatever that time frame may be, a few years, and if there a restoration of all those revenues, then you don't go to the taxpayer, right? Then you have the monies to be able to use them for however you think is the best way to use them at that time. But the majority of reductions in this budget are related to like revenue losses, which is a very different, just making reductions. They're not just making it's only because we're losing money, so different.
And the thing, and I know there's a fair amount of people from the town community online, but for the board to understand as well, I think one of the challenges that we've had as a board is we lose 900,000. At the same time, we're hearing from people in the community who are saying, well, I'm losing either job, or I'm losing hours, or I'm losing revenue. And so they're saying, well, hey, can you bring down our taxes also, or not tax us as much? So that becomes a double revenue hit that we're trying to manage. We're having to make all these cuts at a time where we're proposing a little bit less than a lot of the other area districts at a 0.95%. At the same time, a lot of people would like their taxes to stay flat or even go lower. So we're getting kind of a double hit on revenue and a double pinch from both what taxpayers feel they want and need, or some taxpayers, and what the state is able to provide us. So that's what's made our job particularly challenging this this time around. Okay, thanks, Allison. Someone else, thoughts where you are, or what you need more clarity on?
Well, I just wanted to share sort of 3 thoughts. One, pertaining to the kindergarten class size, and I know community members have reached out to us, and we talked about it in the last board meeting. And the data really is showing that having 5 sections is a sensible way to move forward. But I would hope that just as we would in any other budgetary season, that we can continue to look at that number and see if there's any fluctuation. For example, after New York State opens up its ability to have real estate showings, because they're recently been reading about sort of exodus from New York City to Connecticut, New Jersey in particular, because those states have real estate visitation still, house showings. New York doesn't. So if and when New York or Westchester opens up real estate, we may see an influx of population that we're not anticipating. So if we can continue to look at that like we would through any budgetary season, I think that's important. And then in terms of the AOK classes, I know that the middle school administration offered that as an area of reduction, and it became too tangled to address that. But I would hope that the administrative team at the middle school, and together with Melissa and Valerie, if that's something that in the future could be looked at as an area of opportunity for students and for learning, to just see how that time period could be enhanced or reinvigorated, I think would be an asset to the middle school. And then lastly, I want to just really think about, I know we're concerned, and I am sorry that we're at a state where we're removing FLES and the 5th grade world language program, but to think about how that time can be used for in the elementary school and in the 5th grade to help students have another time slot where they're doing something that's student-directed, self-directed learning, maybe longer term projects or exploratory programming, to really think about that time, particularly as we re-enter school, the significance of giving students spaces to have their own exploration and drive their own learning, and to think about that time that we're losing away from that particular program as an opportunity to infuse some of the more progressive experiences that younger students deserve.
Thank you, Lauren. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, I mean, this is, yeah, I look at it as really a worst case scenario budget. And so I appreciate the way that you, Valerie and Maureen have thought about it, because if we do wind up in the worst case scenario, I think we'll look like, oh, I'm glad we thought through some of these things ahead of time. But to Doug's point, it would be great if we do wind up seeing less of a cut than we hoped for. So, there's definitely areas that I think, I don't think anyone is happy with the last 2 rounds of reductions, but I do think one of the things that we wanted to do was try to make it as equitable as possible and keep things out of the classroom. And I think for the most part, we've been able to do that. And there are a lot of areas that are sort of, you can argue one way or the other, but I think for the most part, I think this budget hits, or keeps enough meat there. I do have a question about, I guess, Doug, you had kind of mentioned this. We hear some people saying, we want you to lower the taxes even lower. And Maureen, this always confuses me a little bit. I'm sure it confuses others on the board. I'm sure there are people on the community who confuse it or may not even understand how the formula works. But if we were to lower the tax rate from 0.95 to 0.5 or 0.7 or whatever it is, what does that mean for next year? So does that means that we can't hit, I guess the the cap is 2%, but it's not really 2% because it's based on what you raised it last year, and then so maybe you can kind of just walk through that again, so I really understand it. And I know this is hard because our fixed costs are. I mean, we start with 2% salary increases for teachers every year, but it's really more than that because the step increases make it like what 3 or 4%. So we're even with the tax cap, we're kind of starting from zero. But can you explain so it's really clear to me what it means if we do lower the taxes, what that means in terms of future years, how difficult it then becomes?
Yeah, so it is very challenging. Prior to the tax cap, in years where we felt as though we could appropriate more fund balance and bring down the rate, there were years that we were able to do it, but it didn't prohibit you from raising taxes at a higher level the following year. So the tax cap calculation is based on your tax levy, which again is not your entire budget to budget. It's based on your individual tax levy. And in our case, our tax levy for this current year that we're proposing is $43,800,000. So the state then, there's a number, and the number is derived by what the consumer price index is for that particular year. And it can never be more than 2%. So it's 2% or less. And this year it was 1.81%. And there were some other individual growth factors that were related to Hastings individually to do with assessment growth that allowed us to have that levy to grow by about 3% or so. But what happens is that is your starting off point for the following year. So to your point, Jeremy, as we look at it, as we consider bringing that number below the current year's allowable tax cap, that starts your base off for the following year at a lower number, right? So part of that is it's fine if your next year you're able to manage it, but if in fact, say next year, which again, this is what they're saying, of course we don't know, they're suggesting that because inflation, the number will be lower next year, we could very well only be able to levy 1% next year. So by leaving that $200,000 or $300,000 or $500,000 say we reduced our levy this year, we said we're going to bring it down and we want to reduce it, $300,000 or $400,000 lower than the tax cap levy. It would, definitely be helpful to our taxpayers in thinking about that. But then thinking the following year, you are starting at a lower place, and then it may be difficult. It may be more difficult the following year to with budget growth, to your point, which can exceed 2%. Like that's where we start getting stuck. And it's, I don't have to put it in a spreadsheet to kind of demonstrate what it looks like, but that's why the tax cap, although it's useful, and I'm sure people appreciate that it kind of caps taxes. It is very difficult because in years that you may want to potentially have a lower tax rate, it kind of hurts you in future years, right? Because it's starting at a lower base, and especially if we're thinking about a period in which we may be capped at a 1% growth, and we've experienced that under the tax cap legislation. So because of that, most districts, the thought around it is to try to get as close to your max cap as possible, because the following year it sets you with a larger base number. And I know that sometimes it's hard for people to hear that, but it is a sort of a double-edged sword, the tax cap, because of that, because it prohibits your ability in the following year. So it'd be something that would probably be easier if I demonstrated it in a chart form, because to speak to it, you'll see it like it would be easier to see if you see what that would mean on a year to year. So that's the challenge, Jeremy. If the board were to, as we know currently, we have a few $100,000 that we have not, about $300,000 or so that we have not appropriated to reserves, that could potentially be used to reduce the tax levy for next year, which would result in a lower tax rate for taxpayers. It would be great, but it kind of may potentially hurt us the following budget season, because we would then be starting with like a kind of artificially lower levy than we needed, right? Because we're offsetting it with savings that we have this year. So our expenses are going to still grow. To Jeremy's point, our expenses just on, health insurance and contractual expenses, sometimes those two things alone could exceed over $1 million of growth in a year to year. So, thinking about that, that's what makes it challenging to, how low do we want that tax levy to be before we start really hurting hurting future years' budgets? Does that kind of? Sorry.
To break it down, Maureen, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but our tax cap calculation would mean to the average homeowner in Hastings, which is average around $750,000, the full 1.81 is somewhere in the ballpark of about $300 per average taxpayer in Hastings. The current proposed budget has cut that in half to about 0.9, 0.95, at about $150 a year tax increase, right?
Right.
And then the question is, do we do something further than that? We've cut it in half. Do we do something further than that? Do we put that money into a reserve, tax cert reserve? Or do we do something else with that money? So that's really kind of one of the questions that's going to be on the table.
Yeah. So if you were to use, say, the 300,000 or so available, currently not appropriated, and again, we haven't final, we're not fully done with our fiscal year. It doesn't end until 6/30, and that's when we have our final calculation. But currently, the 300,000 or so we believe that we have available. If we were to use that to offset taxes, that would bring an individual taxpayer, instead of having an increase of about $150 a year, that would put them more in maybe like a $70 a year increase. So just to kind of give you a sense of what, to an individual person, it would maybe, reduce that amount. But to the budget for the following year, it could put us, it could potentially be difficult. That's all. So just kind of as we talk through it, I think it is an important conversation to have, Doug, because to your point, we're being challenged with the reduction in revenues, but equally important is people are also having a tough time and trying to manage, what that would look like also if we were to propose a lower than levy increase.
Okay, so thanks for that, Maureen. Tim, Jody, looks like we lost Sylvia. Maybe she dialed in. But Tim or Jody, do you have any thoughts or anything you need further clarification on?
Jody, I'll let you start.
Jody might not be able to figure out how to get mute off.
Sylvia's connection went down. She's trying to get back into the meeting.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Jody, why don't you go ahead and start?
You want me to go first, Tim?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, can you hear me okay, Doug?
Yes.
Sorry, it's a little noisy in the car.
Okay.
Go ahead.
None of this is pleasant. None of us want to have to go through this and make these cuts. I guess the thing that I would say, there are certainly many things that others have brought up that I would be on board with our revisiting should we be able to put money back in the budget. I guess across the board, what I'd like to say is more a way of thinking about it, which is there are things that we're cutting, positions we're cutting, money, whether it's science or world language or theater, whatever, that I would hope that going forward, my worry is always that once things get cut, they don't get added back in. And I would just like everyone to kind of be able to keep an open mind, maybe not this year, maybe in the future, but some of those things need to get added in. And I just don't like the idea that once things are out, they're kind of out for good. And I think we're only cutting things because we're in a very tight crunch time. And I thank you, Maureen, because I think you are a bit of a magician at times. But I think, That's really what I need to say. You can mute me again. I don't want to. It's very noisy where I am. So.
Okay. Janine, do you want to do the mute trick one more time and then?
Okay, everyone should be muted and you can unmute yourselves.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Jody, for that. Sylvia or Tim, do you have anything you need further clarification or questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to say that, from my perspective, this is all about being a point of tension between maintaining the integrity of the programs and the excellence that we want to offer to our student population for all the students. And at the same time, understanding that we want to minimize the impact that's felt for staff and students, because we are in a very austere situation, one that's very uncertain, and one that we're called upon to navigate in a responsible way. Given the fact that the state situation is so unknowable, I find difficulty, in being anything. I hesitate to say that I'm satisfied with the way things stand in the budget, but I think this is the place that we find ourselves in, that we have to implement cuts across the board and make it be a shared burden. There isn't anybody that is untouched by the budget that we're putting forth. And in that, there seems to be a certain amount of fairness, I think. I'm not saying that it's anything that any of us approach with any type of, no one would choose to be in this situation. And I think we all pore over this and really agonize over anybody who will lose anything, whether that's staff, whether that's students. But there's so much that we don't know about how this illness is going to impact us in the long term and even in the short term. And so it's painful, but in my estimation, it's also necessary to proceed with what we've had, because I do think that we've done what we can to solicit the input from stakeholders to understand where can we minimize the pain that's going to be felt. And if I'm called upon to vote on this, with what has been been put forth to me, and the explanations and the rationales that have been presented, knowing that they have been done in good faith, I would feel comfortable voting for this budget as it's been set forth before me.
Thank you, Sylvia.
I think that probably leaves me. Melissa and Valerie, first, can you talk to me a little bit about the summer compensatory program, what our neighboring districts are doing, how they're approaching it, how are they funding it in terms of magnitude of funding?
It depends on what districts had in place before this, terrible crisis that impacts all of us, in some shape, form, or fashion. So some of the districts have traditionally offered a summer program for children who are probably at risk of falling behind their grade level peers, and so the summer is traditionally a time to mitigate and close gaps. So that's, certainly in every district that I've been in, there's been a summer program of some sort, and it just depends upon the budget that the school districts establish. I don't know what the other districts are doing, but they sat in on the same conversation that I sat in on, where we all talked about, that there's no way that the virtual learning experiences can compensate for, what children who are already on the cusp in terms of falling behind would benefit from it to the degree that they would, be where their grade level peers are in the fall. So it's more about, I guess, philosophy of, how do you want to support those children? Because they're going to be here, and the needs will be here in terms of, closing those achievement gaps. As I said, it's all about what districts have done traditionally. I know that, take Harrison, for example, they've always had a summer program. And so whichever children they identify as a result of, not making gains, or children who are at risk of falling behind, they can fold those young people into the summer program. So, that's as much comparative information that I can share, Tim, but I can tell you it's pretty standard operating, sort of procedure that those are in place, for those reasons. They're also in place for, you take Hastings, for example. They've had enrichment programs that they offer over the summer, but they've also had some of the other types of programs where, as I said, they're targeted to closing gaps.
Yes, and I would just add, I have the opportunity to speak with my Quad Village counterparts weekly, and they're really in the early phases of starting to think through. I think everyone's in sort of a similar place, thinking about what sort of tools would be most beneficial to students, who is it most beneficial to be serving, given the realities of budget constraints. I know that in some districts in the region, they're thinking about, I know Yorktown was talking about, can we draw from some of the recorded lessons that have been happening? But we've been hearing from our community and thinking about, what Valerie just said about philosophy, right? That we're thinking that it is important to have a live synchronous component, because if we want to get the most amount of growth for students in real time, having them have opportunities to have that targeted small group support, and then supplement them with adaptive resources that are really responsive to exactly where they are, would not just help prevent additional slide, but would also help to expedite and close the gap. But we're slightly ahead in our planning process, and we're remaining in close contact throughout the region.
Okay, yeah, the reason I asked, I think we talked probably either at the last board meeting or the prior work session to that about the possibility of combining forces with a neighboring district. I would think either probably Dobbs or Ardsley would be the two in terms of immediate proximity. It doesn't sound like that's a possibility at this point, based on what you're both saying.
It's pretty tough to pull this kind of, service together. I mean, there are other services or, ways to share costs, which are, much more seamless. What we have talked about, Tim, is certainly if the school districts are asked to continue the childcare program and the meal program over the summer, that definitely is one of the examples of how to, one of the examples that we're going to deploy our, concerted, resources to, combine districts so that, there's some shared cost with regards to the staff and, all the parts that goes, that accompany those programs. But in terms of summer, there are traditional summer school programs that, certainly districts, could send children to. But those were specific to, Regents Prep, for example. So they were sort of the emergency last chance types of programs, and it wasn't ideal for children. I mean, I was in my former district. We didn't run a Regents Prep program over the summer, so those young people did have to go to another school district if they wanted to take advantage of that. So just using that example, I think it probably is not so, it may not be so easy, it may not be so easily done this year, primarily because every district is considering, what would it look like? How do you integrate virtual? How much of the virtual? What is your strategy for targeting what children need? So there are a lot of variables that I think are a bit challenging at this juncture. But certainly, if we were to be looking at this in the coming year, I think everyone is trying to consider all the ways that, we can economize. And one of the reasons for reducing the program from the initial proposal of 250 to 150 was, for that reason of knowing that, we probably are not going to be able to easily find ways to share costs with other districts relative to this program.
Okay. No, that doesn't surprise me. I just wanted to make sure that we touched on it because we spoke about the combination approach a few weeks back. What are my broad thoughts on this budget proposal? I think it'll probably come as a surprise to no one. I find the budget a bit disheartening. I certainly echo a lot of the comments about the difficult choices. Whether it's little issues like I've raised in the past, think about the diversity coordinator position. I think Janice has done great work. I have a lot of respect for the work for her approach to teaching and a lot of respect for the impact that she has on students. I know that, directly in my own household. I still look at and will continue to stand by, we raised that position from a 0.2 release time to a 0.6 release time in an environment where we're talking about cutting world language for fifth graders and cutting science, which is going to impact AP physics and AP earth science. I can't sit here and say I'm comfortable with a 0.6 release diversity coordinator position and that those core subjects are getting cut. So that's going to be my fundamental philosophy. I recognize I'm going to be in the minority here. And so
Tim, just for accuracy, it's 0.4 is the diversity release time.
Okay, so 0.2 release time for E&L and 0.4, 0.6 total for the position. So you can slice it either way, whether we remove the release time for E&L or we take the diversity position, go from 0.4 to 0.2. It's the same net number, however you approach it. It's my philosophical approach. It won't be popular. I'm okay with not being popular. Away from that, while I haven't seen the challenges associated with reconfiguring AOK, I respect that those challenges exist. I would still like to, core programming that will hit every fifth grader versus a rejiggering of the AOK. I would like to, at a personal level, see that attempted. So do I, with that, I guess also the idea of, I guess the final point is the idea of incremental savings. As much as I consider myself a reserve hawk, fiscal hawk with a very clear reserve bias, to consistently increase reserves. Like I think others have said, I am concerned that when core programming is cut, that it doesn't get added back. So if some of that money that has been talked about for lower taxes as a possibility is put direct into our program, even understanding that it's a one-year reprieve, at least then building leaders and professionals throughout each of the departments knowing it's exactly that, a one-year reprieve. Right, so that's my overall view. they're big program cuts that are going to impact our students in a major way. We have a lot of change going through the buildings. We have change in scheduling in the middle school coming. There's a lot of moving parts, and to really cut some of these programs, and I certainly appreciate the need to get our operating budget down. And I guess I appreciate that if you have them one additional year and the state doesn't increase its funding, which I consider to be probably fall into the category of less likely than more likely, that, as I just said prior, my approach may represent nothing more than a one-year reprieve for this, for these core areas. But 1 year and an opportunity to work on it is better than no years. So that's my take on it, Doug, and everyone else on the board. And that's it.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I don't want to belabor. I agree with a lot of what's been said, especially the point around this isn't easy for anyone. I think that the approach from the get-go around, get some screaming kids in the background here. I think the approach from the get-go to share the pain, I think, was a good one. I know we've received notes from people in the community who are rather upset that one thing is being cut. We've also received notes from people who are upset that sometimes programs seem to be pitted against each other in some of these cuts. And I think we were really trying to be very sensitive to that, looking for obvious places to make some of these. And I feel none of them are obviously comfortable, but they are necessary. And the process of sharing some of that pain, I think, was a smart one and a good one. And I think largely it's meant that nothing did get wholesale slashed. I think there were places where someone was retiring, and to me that does give us a reprieve for the year to not make that higher, because what it means is that no one's losing their job in that specific instance, for example, in world language. And so that made a lot of sense to me from a people perspective. Obviously, people are losing their jobs, so I don't want to say that that's not the case. It is, and that's challenging. I also appreciate the way the building leaders went about looking for not necessarily cutting programs, but really looking at tightening scheduling and sharing the pain across buildings. I know that was not easy. I think that was a very challenging exercise. And so, but I think it was well worth it because it does, again, share some of that pain. On the topic of adding stuff back and what do we do with, I've been thinking quite a bit about this idea of what happens if September, what happens if Friday comes, we don't get cut that much? Well, I don't know. Maybe we're trying to call an emergency board meeting on Monday before the Tuesday vote. Who knows? I don't think that's going to happen because I think the downward pressure on the tax revenue is pretty clear right now. But, look, if something happens in September or December at those, what I would be willing to say is that there's a couple things here that I think I'd be willing to say if we hear that, we could add back. I did notice in this, I think wholesale adding back full positions gets kind of challenging, but where it's smaller and where it can make a really material impact on children for programs that touch a lot of kids, but for small dollars, I think it's worth us looking at adding those back. And I would, if say September, the September number comes out, I'd be up for looking at restoring some of the stuff for the theater program, looking at restoring modified team sports. Again, these are programs that are, relatively speaking, lower dollar, but touch a lot of children, and a lot of children really appreciate. And so, I would be up for leaving that door open and reinstating some of those as we get more knowledge towards the end of the summer and beginning of the year. So that's something, yeah, I don't know that we necessarily have to really, that's not going to be something we vote on because it doesn't impact this direct budget right now. I just want to throw that out as something that I'm, very open to, down the road. I think that's really where I'm netting out. At this point, I'm prepared to support this budget and vote for it. I would like to talk a little bit more about the surplus issue with the board right now and just get some final clarity, because I think these are some decisions that we have to make. The surplus, when you add in stuff that we didn't use this year, either because a position was never hired or someone left in the middle of the year, plus the surplus for the expenses we didn't use because of COVID. We're at somewhere at the high twos, 2.8 or so million. We've said we're going to put 1.65 into the appropriated for the operating budget this year. We're putting approximately $1 million in the reserves between the retirement reserve and the liability reserve, as we've discussed. And it leaves probably somewhere in the ballpark to 150 to 300,000. We're not going to know exactly what that number is. And I think we have some decisions about what we do with that money. And I think what the options on the table are, number one, we put it into a reserve fund, something like the tax cert fund, which it certainly sounds like there will be some pressure inside of the tax certs that we may be receiving. We use it to potentially reduce the levy for this year, and the numbers that Maureen just went through. And there is an option to use it to restore programs. However, that's a kind of a one-time fee, and there's always some danger in doing that. On that point, I would love to hear from the board as to what some of your thoughts were on how to use or how to apply that money.
No one else is going to go. I'll just weigh in. I think that I'm just going to look at my notes on what the three options are, but I think that restoring something in the budget is not wise for all the moves, all the things that we just said before, in terms of we're not really at a place. I mean, if we get to September and we have a better outlook than we thought we did, then that's one thing. But to restore it now doesn't make a lot of sense, because a lot of these are yearly expenses, and it will only make it tougher next year. And I think that we have kind of arrived at an area that I feel comfortable with. I think lowering the tax rate, if the tax cap was straightforward like it should be, if it was 2% and every year we could go up to 2%, and then I'd be in favor of lowering to save people money on their taxes. But it doesn't work that way, as Maureen described, and it really puts us in a weird kind of counterintuitive place where it actually hurts us to lower it this year. It hurts us next year, and the contractual obligations are not going away next year. So we are, even without COVID-19, we're going to be in a tight spot next year and this year. So I am for allocating it to a reserve fund. I don't know that, do we have to kind of allocate or say the specific reserve fund? Is there wiggle room in terms of?
No, you don't have to do it. I guess it was just in case there was a decision made that would change our actual budget that you would be voting on. That's what we would need to know. the final accounting of of what monies are left over at the end of the year is typically done like the last board meeting in June, because that's when we're able to finalize our expenses, and then, you know, make that final determination. And that's part of why, you know, because again, we do have things that we're still open, and there are things that, you know, once we're done at the end of the fiscal year, we make those appropriations at that point. But knowing we had some additional monies that we hadn't appropriated to reserves, and the budget conversation hadn't been finalized, you know, we wanted to ensure that whatever the decision was, if it was going to impact this budget, then we would have to fold that in prior to your adoption. If you were to go with the option of either appropriating monies to restore or appropriating monies to reduce the tax levy. And everything that you said is the challenge I think we all have because of wanting to provide the tax relief, but that I think Sylvia said everything is so unknown. It's actually, I mean, there's always a little bit of that goes on, but this is by far, everyone is struggling so much with their budgets. Not, I'm saying, you know, unique to Hastings, like Valerie said, you know, speaking to my counterparts, they're not even, they're still working on them. They're not even at the final kind of what you're seeing this evening, because there's everyone's really struggling and trying to understand and putting our best thoughts, because of course we, you know, wish, you know, we don't know what's going to be told to us on Friday, but even at that point, it's not even a final number at that point. So we just have to go forward with this. But yeah, so sorry, but that was, you know, what I wanted to offer you the opportunity to decide if there was any change to this budget that's being proposed, and if so, then if there was a need to put any dollars from that additional monies anywhere.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what others have to say, but it is unfortunate that the rules are that, you know, if we lower the taxes, that it hurts us in the future. It really, I know that most people, you know, don't know about that, and it doesn't seem like it makes, it doesn't make sense.
That's why it's very frustrating, because there years prior to the tax cap legislation, there were years in which when we had the opportunity to offset it, and we would, and those were years in which when we had additional money, we typically would offset it immediately, because we knew it wouldn't start, you know, if the following year we needed to raise taxes 3.5%, we weren't going to be capped in doing that. So I think that's the first couple of years of the tax cap legislation, we actually did levy less than that allowable amount, and there were times in which we regretted doing that. So it's challenging, but it definitely, considering the crisis that people are in, it definitely needs to be discussed to think about what's the best way to move forward.
And I do think, you know, netting out at 0.95, I'm impressed that you were able to figure out a way to do it. I mean, you know, as Doug mentioned, we started at 1.8 or 1.85, and we've kind of cut it down. You know, based on all those different rules and everything, I just don't see that the risk that we're taking to save people $20, $30 on their taxes doesn't seem worth it to me.
And the other thing just to think about, if the decision that the board wants to move forward with, reserve money is not, you know, the school district's money, it's the community's money. And I really feel very strongly, I know it is very easy to think it's, you know, the school district kind of with the coffers. The money is always put there to ensure that the village, the Hastings on Hudson, you know, all of the people who live in the village, it's really put there to ensure that we're being responsible stewards of the money. And it's not to, you know, increase taxes unnecessarily and hold money in reserves. It's really with making sure, as we spoke about tax cert obligations, you know, we're aware of them, and we feel very strongly that we would be irresponsible if we weren't reserving for obligations that, not to just use that money, because obviously if you have additional money, you could also just spend it. I mean, we're not recommending just spending the money. We're recommending either to lower taxes, or again, putting in a reserve. It would then be returned to the taxpayers, maybe not next year, but then the following year, right? So it's more the timing of the return of the funds rather than it being not returned. I think that's kind of a clarification that I always think about. it's not so much as giving it next year, but any monies we put into reserves, even the last meeting, the reason that money went in there is solely for it to be used in the 21-22 school year to offset those obligations to the pension system. We think it was important. We, the COVID, as although terrible, did afford us some savings. We put that money away, but with the, with understanding that there's going to be some increases in the costs of those pension obligations, and we wanted to be smart and put the monies away so when they hit the district, we can pay those obligations and not tax for them. So, again, it's just for all the taxpayers, any money that put in there are just to meet future obligations. And then we wouldn't be taxing for them at that time. We'd be using the funds and reserves.
Okay, thanks, Maureen. Others?
I'm leaning toward putting any surplus in reserves. I mean, the environment we're in right now, or in our conversation tonight, we're speaking about, we don't even know what decisions are being made this Friday. And it's impossible to really predict what kind of snowballing is going to continue in our economy and from Albany. I think it's the wisest move, although I am sensitive to the request to lower our taxes. I think, a further explanation at another point as to exactly why that's not a wise choice would be beneficial to the community. But I think from where I'm thinking tonight, I think any additional monies that we have should be put aside in reserves.
My feeling is the same as Lauren's right now. It's just too volatile a time not to do that. And I agree with your suggestion to explain why in further detail if people need to understand it, because it is very confusing. And it feels hard not to give that money back right now, but it seems like it's not wise.
It's the same for me.
Well,
I feel like in a constantly fluctuating environment, it's hard for me to approach with anything other than like a conservative, hopefully pragmatic approach, which is to say that you put this money aside and pray that we're not going to have to, delve too deeply into it, but it should be there at the ready. Not knowing what's going to happen after Friday, not knowing what's going to happen after June 30th, September 30th, December 31st, it's all coming at us, in waves that we can't foresee. And I wouldn't feel good about doing anything other than setting that money aside. That's my take.
Jim, did you have a thought? You started.
No, my opinion. Right? Like, I look at the core programming cuts, and I think that I'm saddened that we're not even discussing one of those subject areas to preserve. So, but I know how, I see where the thought process is, and it is what it is. I hate that saying. I take that back. I see where the majority view is, and while my view is different, I'll abide by the majority.
Okay. Jody, I don't know if Jody can unmute herself while she's driving, but I'll share some thoughts. And Jody, if you're able to do that, you can chime in whenever. Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
With having to make the cuts, and I do like what people have said in terms of the way it's been somewhat of a shared burden. I'm also always concerned about the tax burden on the community. And so I do think that, I know there are different ways that we can think about this, but I do think that we need to add that variable to our final decision of any way that we can um, that we can minimize the tax burden. It may not be to the extreme that everybody would want, but I think, I guess what Sylvia said before, that there's so many unknowns, and we may get hit with many more unknowns. And I think there are many people in the community who are being hit very hard, and we don't even necessarily hear about it. And they may not, and there may be many more people who suffer in their financially and lose jobs or lose income. And I certainly, in the midst of it, don't want to make it more difficult for people to stay in Hastings. So I'd like to, sorry, there's some bizarre way to get back to New York here. Anyway, so I guess I'd like to do it in a way where we can also have a little bit of an impact on the tax burden.
Yeah. Thank you, Jody. Yeah, you know, I've struggled with this a little because I understand the attractiveness given the current work environment and people's financial burdens. And I think, you know, so where I've netted out on it is, Jody, are you able to hit mute or no on your phone? I think we're getting some.
I have to mute everyone now, and then you'll have to unmute yourself again, Doug.
Okay. So the way I was thinking about it is, you know, we did, you know, I think when we started this process back in late February, or we started the process before that, but when we got to our latest pre-COVID budget, we were acknowledging a very tight environment in which budgeting was going to be tough even before any of this happened. And at that point, I think we were talking about you know, going up to the 1.81. I think we've done a good job getting it down to 0.95. So we've essentially cut half of the allowable tax cap, and that's brought you know, the average burden at a $750,000 average home in the town from 300 down to 150. And I think it's prudent to leave it there for now, given the challenging environment of tax cap environment and the challenging kind of baseline you have to work with the following year. It's going to make it even harder if we bring it down even further to start finding ways to bring back some of these positions. So I'm comfortable leaving it at 0.95 and you know, recognizing that that has you know, cut the potential increase down in half as it is. And perhaps if we didn't lose all the money from the state or weren't planning so conservatively, you know, I might have a different opinion there. It's a difficult decision, I understand, but I think it's going to put us in a position to be able to be stronger in the years to come. So I think that's really all we have right now. I do want to just mention one point about the bond. I know we've been getting emails from people about the bond, and our plan is to discuss that on the 19th. So how do we approach that? And what I want to clarify for the board and for anyone listening is that there aren't current decisions, and Maureen and Valerie, correct me if I'm wrong, there aren't any current decisions that we're making right now that the bond is going to impact the 2021 budget. Is that correct? Because even if we bond for something, those debt service payments wouldn't hit until a year or two later. Is that correct, Maureen?
Yeah, that's correct. So currently we're planning, we will need to borrow money in in this upcoming school year, but you borrow in the year and then the interest for that money would be due the following year. But to your point, Doug, we were also looking at a strategy to depending on the work that's occurring to, although we would have some interest due in the 21-22 school year, the principal of that debt we're looking to push off into further years. So.
Okay.
But there is, yes, currently there is no interest or any payment due for that monies next year. And in terms of just, I mean, not to, when we talk about reserves and putting the money back, you know, some districts are also another possibility when you have additional monies you could do is you could pay down some of your current debt. So we could have current debt off of the field. So that is a possibility beyond tax cert, another option for us as we think about our capital spending in general. We have an opportunity to pay down some principal if we chose to do that, which would be helpful in the future as you know, that would reduce tax obligations related to that debt in the future. So that may be something we think about as we think about our capital spending in total.
And Maureen, that's actually a pretty attractive option. We exercised it, that was a practice in my former district. Whatever extra money we had, we paid down our debt.
Yeah, and that's something districts
appreciate that.
Yeah, so that would be, and that would be going toward the debt related to the field work. So that's enough. We do have a debt service account, and that is actually, interestingly, even the governor's office, I was reading in a guidance, well, no, the controllers, they were actually saying to districts, because they knew we would have some extra money, they're also saying to look at possibly paying out debt, capital debt. And we've done it before, but that was something I was also wanted to look at. You know, I mean, we talked about the tax cert, but certainly we can look at that as an option, because that would also be helpful in the budget, because it would reduce, you know, potential, you know, money related to tax increases related to debt in future budgets. So, but we are going to be talking about our bond at our current bonding and giving a status update on where that project is, and give some sense of what the financial impact of borrowing that money will be and strategies around that.
Can we refinance that existing debt based on the lower rates today?
Yeah, so some of that, well, currently, the bond debt, I think, is not callable because we lock in. We've refinanced debt in the past when we've had higher debt, but the last bond we issued for the fields, although it's low, it's not as maybe low as current interest rates, but at that time, sometimes if you do the non-callable bonds, you do lock into a better rate at that time, which was you know, still is better. But I'll look at that, Jeremy, as to see if there is any ability to do so, but I don't believe so on this current debt. But again, we do have the opportunity to do some prepay, and because of interest and the way it compounds, even sometimes paying $300,000 or $400,000 off of that debt could potentially have a very positive impact on, you know, just as we think about those upcoming few years of budgets, that could be helpful in reducing obligation. So, or removing it at least, and that would help us also manage when new debt needs to come on, managing those shifts and bumps. And that's why districts pay down debt service, because it helps you then manage that, you know, pay off some older debt, and then at the same time with some of that debt that may be coming on, that may be a good strategy for us to think about.
Thank you, Maureen. There's just two quick things. We've gotten some notes about the library position reduction at Hillside. That has, just for the board and anyone listening, you didn't see that here. That's come off. Just realized that it was not going to be a doable reduction, so that will stay as is. The other thing, having nothing to do with the budget, but just because we're all here together, we've gotten some notes about the tennis courts. And that's just something I think that we want to address their use. I think what we've been hearing, if you all didn't look at your email and anyone else on the call, is that a variety of pros have kind of moved in and started using the courts to run their lessons, which has social distancing challenges. And, you know, they're using our courts to, you know, run their lessons and make money with their students, which really is not in the spirit of opening up our tennis courts for the community. So we will be looking at that and address it perhaps we'll chat about that in the in the coming week. Is the best way, but at least a sign that says, no tennis lessons here for profit. This is a community resource to help people with their sanity to get out of the house. That's all I had. Does anyone else have anything else that they want to address before we close?
No, please just let us know, because we do have security that is also, we can send and check the tennis courts if that's an issue.
Yeah, so that may be one of the
I think,
options, yeah.
I think what you want to do just around this, and we can talk to Joe about it, is add some signage. I mean, there's plenty of fence space. Add some pretty significant signage. It makes it very clear in very bold letters that the courts are not for private lessons. Whether that be a one-on-one private lesson, a for-profit private lesson, one-on-one or large group. Secondly, that to the extent that any resident sees that, please feel free to either call our security number. One, there should be self-enforcement, and two, residents should feel free to call our security number, or if necessary, I don't know that it's against the law, so maybe I'm getting ahead of myself with Hastings Police, but certainly our security number. And I think that signage made clear enough will deter people, because our residents are perfectly happy to self-report. So I think that signage is the right first step.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll make sure there's some signage up tomorrow.
And Doug,
Okay.
what time do you want to
Yeah.
start the board meeting on the 19th?
I guess 6. I'm just thinking it's my son's 10th birthday, so yeah, I guess 6 o'clock, just to keep
Does that
things
work
moving.
for everyone?
We could have, well, yeah, I mean, you could have had it on Monday. It was just the 19th was just a date we had set.
One of the issues, the Tuesdays are set by law for the run up to the
Yeah.
vote, but not the actual vote. Is that right?
Well, Tuesday was the vote, so the budget calendar is dictated, but this year is just very
Oh,
unusual.
right. Yeah.
Usually we always see Tuesdays, Doug, because of the fact that we moved our meetings because the board, the election is always the Tuesday, the third Tuesday, right?
Right, so it had to be.
Yeah, so that's how, we always had like 3 or 4 meetings on Tuesdays, and then we revert back to our normal day, that's all. But this year it's a little bit different because of the situation.
So you could change the board meeting.
I mean, I don't know if people can do that. The 18th. Does the 18th work for everyone? Yeah. Lauren? Yeah. Tim?
So Monday, the 18th.
Okay, let's change it. Let's change it to Monday the 18th, and then I can tell my son I'll be there.
At 6 p.m.
Yes.
Correct? Doug?
Yes, that makes sense.
6 p.m. on Monday, the 18th. Okay.
Good. I think that's it. 8:04. Not bad. Okay. Obviously, if anyone's got further questions as we get to Monday, please reach out to Valerie or Maureen or other board members, and just talk through some stuff. If there's some final questions, if we do need to change something in that final, we can change it in the first, bit of that meeting before we actually vote. So.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, board.
Have a
Thanks
good night.
everybody on the board. We really appreciate all your diligence and time. This couldn't have been easy for you either. So, with gratitude to all of you for doing, a really magnificent job with a very tough task. So thank you.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.